Greetings, good people of the world. Come on in, sit down and relax. Put in your fancy iPhone earbuds. You are now listening to The Message, a podcast that breaks down American foreign policy, the lack of diplomatic engagement and military restraint that is guiding it, the cast of characters that are making this unsustainable problem worse, and how all of this is firmly not in the national interest of the United States. I'm your host, and my name is Reza Marashi. Before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or whatever your favorite podcast platform might be. And if you like what you hear, go to Iranian.com, click on the donate button, and help us continue to fulfill our mission of giving knowledge to the people. Every week, we're going to do 3 things for you. 1, break down 3 news stories that you should know about. 2, interview smart, intellectually honest people who deserve to be heard. And 3, answer your questions that you email to our mailbag. So, without further ado, enjoy the show. To kick things off this week, we're going to go beyond the headlines and do a deep dive on 3 important news stories that the people need to know about. Why do the people need to know about these news stories? That's a great question. Thanks for asking. The people need to know because each of these stories highlights the core tenet that this podcast is built upon, which is that the foundations of American foreign policy are firmly not in the national interest of the United States. Story number 1 this week that you need to know about: Saudi Arabia and its dangerous relationship with the United States. Here's the breakdown. As I'm sure you guys recall, the current crown prince of Saudi Arabia is directly responsible for ordering a grisly, gruesome murder of a Saudi national who was also a Washington Post journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. And there's really been no consequences or repercussions for the Saudi government taking this action. And to date, Trump has essentially given them a free pass. And just the other day, when a reporter questioned who should be held accountable for this journalist's murder, Trump responded saying, maybe the world should be held accountable because the world is a vicious place. The world is a very vicious place. Okay. So beyond the fact that this is a completely ludicrous response, and it's just reprehensible for anyone to give that kind of response, never mind an American president, I think now is a good time. It's an important time to really unpack Saudi Arabia and our relationship with not just the state itself, but also the current crown prince. So let's take a step back and look at what the Saudi government is complicit in. First and foremost, you have 9/11, helping stoke civil war in Iraq, supporting al-Qaeda-linked rebels in Syria, destroying Yemen, occupying Bahrain, breaking up the GCC, stoking sectarianism, and really screwing over its own citizens for decades. And I'm pretty sure Saudi Arabia is not innocent in the rise of ISIS and the role of al-Qaeda, or really relishing in Syria and Yemen's destruction. I don't see anyone I know making the argument that Saudi Arabia is the only awful player here, but wow, they sure are one of them. And I hear a lot of arguments about the Houthis being Iranian proxies. The Houthis are one of the armed opposition groups in Yemen who have taken over the capital. And they say that they're Iranian proxies as opposed to just receiving logistical and intelligence support from Iran, which, by the way, is the frame through which U.S. and Saudi coordination in Yemen is being framed, logistical and intelligence support. But let me ask you a question here. When did this become so? When did the Houthis become Iranian proxies, considering the fact that the Houthis have been waging a mostly localized campaign on and off for over a decade? So when exactly do folks want to argue that this all became a regional proxy war and that the real menace here is Iran? I mean, they don't tie ISIS to Saudi Arabia, despite Saudi books, weapons, and flags being found with ISIS, and yet they tie the Houthis to Iran with much less evidence, right? So it's almost like Iran projects total power in all dimensions, especially the ones that are not real. So I think few would deny that ISIS is a monstrosity, it's abhorrent, it's murderous, but the reality is that the real dangers it poses are bounded. They're limited. I think the Saudi government is also abhorrent, and it's also a murderous monstrosity. But there's a big difference here. And the difference is that the dangers that Saudi Arabia poses, especially with help from its friends, are truly terrifying. you've got war in Yemen and Syria, you've got counter-revolution across the Middle East, and paymaster to the military-industrial complex. So tell me again, who do we have most to fear? And of course, lest we forget about 9/11, you go and read the 28 pages that detail Saudi links to the 9/11 attacks, then you change the word Saudi to Iran and ask yourself how the U.S. government response would have been different at that time. Yeah? So is there a correlation between people who downplay evidence of Saudi links to the 9/11 attacks and people who favor arming al-Qaeda-linked rebels in Syria? Absolutely. No shortage of irony there. And does Donald Trump still favor suing Saudi Arabia for its ties to the 9/11 attacks like he advocated for prior to becoming president? And does he still favor arming Saudi-backed al-Qaeda-linked rebels in Syria? Because those two positions don't really jive with one another, do they? So and it's ironic because the DC establishment left no stone unturned in Iraq trying to find a connection to 9/11, and yet for some reason, Saudi Arabia has gotten a pass for almost 20 years. Why is that? Can you imagine how much better off America would be today if our focus after the 9/11 attacks was on Saudi Arabia rather than Iraq? So it never ceases to amaze me how Americans are more anti-Iran than anti-Saudi, given the type of terrorism that has threatened and killed U.S. citizens since the 9/11 attacks. Because yes, the Iranian government also does some reprehensible stuff in the Middle East, but they're not funding the terrorist organizations that are actively plotting attacks on the United States and have been since 2001. So for those that are say Saudi Arabia is reforming, here's a list of topics that I think are more important than these kinds of reforms than the Trump administration oftentimes likes to trumpet. They're obliterating Yemen, the U.S.-Saudi military-industrial imperial complex. Let's have an honest conversation about that. Let's talk about political prisoners. Let's talk about provocations across the region that could trigger a wider regional war. And let's talk about ways that Saudi policies strengthen ISIS and Al-Qaeda, right? And for all the people out there that are saying that the U.S.-Saudi relationship is special, we should be honest and say that it's special because of the spectacular amount of money involved and the spectacularly enormous level of violence involved. So, with that being said, that's number one. Story number two that you need to know about, let's talk a little bit about Israel and Trump, okay? I don't think this is getting enough attention, especially given the internal political flux inside of Israel right now. But I think it's important mentioning now, regardless of who the future Israeli prime minister is going to be, but especially if it's Netanyahu. So I'd like to think back to when Israelis were celebrating America moving its embassy to Jerusalem, right? And I think that the victory lap that they took then was really premature. And I think that's starting to demonstrate itself right now, even though it had previously. So did Netanyahu and his kindred spirits want the U.S. embassy to relocate to Jerusalem? Obviously, yes. Did they need it, though? Arguably, no. And therein lies the rub, the difference between tactical and strategic victories. Netanyahu and his like-minded individuals inside Israel or the United States, they scored a tactical victory when Trump agreed to move the U.S. embassy. Same with recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, as well as further undermining Palestinian leadership by essentially presenting them with a fait accompli. But are these victories strategic? Arguably not. Israel, led by Netanyahu, was arguably already on solid footing regarding each of these issues. There was no question regarding Israeli control or American support. So from a strategic perspective, neither Netanyahu nor Israel gained much from these developments. They feel nice, they have a toast in Jerusalem, but that's pretty much it. So now here's where Iran enters the picture. I think Netanyahu's lust for war with Iran is well documented, and it got a lot more realistic when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. But Trump is also pushing the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Emiratis to pull their own weight in the region. Let us not forget when Obama called them free riders, right? Good times. But thanks to the aforementioned victories that Trump has handed Israel, Netanyahu is in a bit of a pickle. He's not really in a position to complain much if Trump doesn't push for the war that he wants with Iran. And Israel can't go it alone. And, the Saudis are, the Saudis. So Netanyahu knew, and the Israelis knew, that if push came to shove, George W. Bush and Barack Obama would back Israel in a war with Iran. However begrudgingly, if a war was deemed necessary by both sides. But can the Israelis really be so sure that Trump will do the same? I have my doubts, and the Israelis should too. So the Israelis got a handful of tactical victories, but they're now indebted to Trump, who thinks he's done multiple favors for the Israelis, and thus he's immunized from criticism on the Israel front both at home and abroad. So Israel may have a green light to attack Iran, but it may be forced to go it alone. So in other words, Netanyahu may have gotten played by Trump of all people. Let that sink in as we move on to story number 3 that you need to know about. Protests across the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, etc., etc. And I think it's important to talk about what allows us to distinguish and differentiate between something that looks more like a civil rights movement and something that looks like more of a revolutionary type situation. And I think that there's 4 factors on the government side, 4 factors on the protester side that you should all look out for when we're gauging whether or not there can be fundamental political change that's revolutionary or more of a gradual over time civil rights movement. Factor number 1 is legitimacy in the eyes of the population. Does the ruling system have legitimacy? Does the ruling system efficiently manage the affairs of the state? Is there unity amongst political elites? And does the government maintain a monopoly on violence? And I think when you look at those 4 factors, whether it be in Iraq or Iran or Lebanon or anywhere else in the region, you could say that most of those factors remain intact. Certainly not all of them, but most of them. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, you need to look at the protester situation and what would be necessary to create a revolutionary situation. And number 1, mass discontent amongst the population. Number 2, an organizational network of protesters that coalesces. Number 3, a shared cohesive ideology amongst protesters. And number 4, a clear and widely accepted leadership within the protest movement. And I think, again, when you look at Iran, Iraq, or Lebanon, you don't see the majority of those factors taking root within the protest movement. And it's important to note that those things, those 4 factors on the government side and those 4 factors on the protester side are not simultaneously taking root in the way that would be necessary to create a revolutionary situation, because that shows both outside observers and, frankly, folks inside the country that what we can expect, should the status quo remain the same, is more of a civil rights movement type situation as opposed to a revolutionary type situation. And I think that, while it is oftentimes the flavor of the week to call on America to do more, you have to offer a viable, coherent alternative. And when you're talking about Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, you can't really talk about a military invasion. You can't talk about sanctions that would push the government over the edge, because in all likelihood, there's no internal U.S. government assessment done by career U.S. government officials, not political appointees and ideologues, that would say that those things would actually help the protesters achieve the type of political, economic, and social progress that they strive for, okay? I don't think the U.S. government today possesses any greater ability to affect any outcome of internal affairs of the countries in the Middle East, right? And I think protesters have not asked for America's help beyond moral support. And it's patronizing to suggest that these protesters who are risking their lives are incapable of successfully pursuing their political, economic, and social aspirations without American assistance. So again, these situations remain fluid, but it's really possible to see through the fog if proper metrics are utilized. So again, popular legitimacy, efficient management of the state affairs, political elite cohesion, and coercive capacity can really serve as a barometer for measuring government stability. Similarly, you take stock of popular discontent, organization, ideology, and leadership within the protest movement in order to assess the long-term viability of a protest movement. And when combined, it's possible to determine whether upheaval looks more like a revolution or a civil rights movement. And now it's time for this week's interview, and I couldn't be more excited to share it with you guys because my guest this week is an absolute star. Narges Bajoghli is an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. She's an award-winning anthropologist, filmmaker, and writer. Her academic research focuses on the intersections of media, power, and military in Iran. Her research focuses on pro-regime cultural producers in Iran and is based on ethnographic research with Basij, Ansar Hezbollah, and Revolutionary Guard media producers in Iran. She recently published an excellent book entitled Iran Reframed: Anxieties of Power in the Islamic Republic. It's legitimately one of the best books I've read on Iran in a long time, and you should all go buy a copy as soon as possible. In addition to her academic writing, she's also written for the New York Times, The Guardian, and the Washington Post, and she's also appeared as a guest commentator on NPR, the BBC, and PBS NewsHour. Nagis and I talked about the recent protests in Iran, the twists and turns of Iran's internal politics, U.S.-Iran relations, or lack thereof, and so much, much more. You're not going to want to miss what she has to say. So without further ado, here's Nagis. Nagis, hello.
Hi, Reza.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it. I'm excited that as I get this podcast started and get it going, you're my first guest. It couldn't be more timely.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I want to dive right in. There's so much going on with Iran right now. Protests recently broke out. The government turned off the internet. And I think people inside and outside the country are trying to make sense of all this now. So I think a good place for you and I to start is what happened and why? Like, what's your take?
Oh, this is a hard question because I think we're still trying to figure out what happened. So, obviously we all know the broader story, which is the hike in fuel prices leading to the protests and then leading to an unprecedented violent crackdown of protesters. And I think, the Islamic Republic is now facing this really large moment of thinking about its credibility and its legitimacy in a way that it definitely hasn't had to since 2009, and maybe in a way it's never had to on the scale that it has to today. And I think part of the way that I see what's happening today is a general failure of the Islamic Republic, and then it's accentuated by Trump's maximum pressure policy. So what do I mean by this? Part of the way that I see what's happening today is that we have a situation in which certain parts of the Revolutionary Guard that sees Iran in a state of war vis-a-vis the United States is concentrating power more and more into its hands. And so actually I think we're sort of seeing a internal division within the Islamic Republic about who should be in power moving forward. And I think it's between certain hardline elements of the Revolutionary Guard and those who are being sidelined at the moment, which are the more moderates and reformists in Iran.
I really appreciate the take that you just provided, first and foremost, because you said this is a really hard question to answer. And as I was listening to the news, whether it be on television or radio, I saw a lot of people and heard a lot of people talking very confidently about what was taking place inside the country. And someone like you who spent a decade there on the ground, who just wrote an excellent book, quite literally about this topic, anxieties of power in the Islamic Republic. You, of all people, came out and said, this is a really hard question to answer. So thank you for having the humility to acknowledge that something like this is really tough to parse out. But I think you did a good job of it. And you hit on a few key points that I want to unpack a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Of course.
First, you mentioned this idea of the failure of the Islamic Republic. And I think that that's an important point to address first and foremost. I'll get to the maximum pressure and the Trump administration and all that, because that's no less important. Mm-hmm. But first and foremost, we're talking about an Iranian story that involves Iranians inside the country.
Yeah.
And when you talk about the failure of the Islamic Republic, the first thing that pops into my mind is the political, economic, and social aspirations of millions of people across the country, a very diverse socioeconomic swath of Iranian society, where those aspirations have been long unmet in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
That's the first thing that pops into my mind when you say the failure of the Islamic Republic. But am I right to assume that's what you mean, or I want to know what specifically you mean when you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, So, first of all, I mean, as a social scientist, I am never going to try to make predictions because we are very bad at that. And I think anyone who thinks that they can predict the future of any society is BSing, because there are certain indicators that we can take from historical precedent in each locale and think about how that may pertain to today's environment and in a place like Iran or anywhere else. But societies are so dynamic and nothing is predetermined, so it's very difficult to actually think about what may happen. But when I talk about, or when I said the failure of the Islamic Republic, part of what I'm referring to is exactly what you're pointing to, which is that through for various reasons, the Islamic Republic has not been able to respond to the promises of its own revolution in the social and cultural and economic and political life of its citizens. And especially given what happened a couple of weeks ago and the way in which it began to repress this latest round of protests, I think it goes to show you that this level of suppression can only happen when the state no longer thinks that it can control the situation in any ways other than force. And so that's what I mean about the failure of the Islamic Republic. If it still could count on popular support among certain sectors of the population, especially in larger numbers, it wouldn't need to crack down in the way that it did. So that's sort of what I'm alluding to, and it's the point that you picked up on. Yeah,
I think that's a very important point to make. Well, there's a couple of important points that you made. First and foremost, when we talk about the inability or unwillingness of various parts of the Islamic Republic to move forward and reform and change in ways that would be more responsive to its own citizens. A lot of times people say, oh, the only things that Iranians can agree on is their dislike of the Mujahideen, and maybe that's it. I think it's a little bit more complicated or complex than that. But I think this is one thing that all Iranians can probably agree on is, a lot has been left to be desired as a result of how this government has taken one step forward and two steps back in a variety of different factors, a variety of different ways. You'd also touched upon this idea of legitimacy. Mm-hmm. And here's where I think the connection between what just happened in Iran and the book that you just released to the public, which everybody should go and cop, because you couldn't possibly read a more timely book, a more poignant book, given what's going on in Iran right now. It's almost like you planned it this way, but how could you possibly plan something like that? Like you said, trying to predict Iranian politics is a very humbling experience. Like, when I was in the game, I never described myself as an Iran expert. Because the second you call yourself an Iran expert, something happens in Iran that disproves everything that you just said after you called yourself an Iran expert. So, but you touched upon this idea of legitimacy. And I feel like in the book that you wrote, something that stood out to me was this understanding amongst, a variety of stakeholders inside the Iranian government that understood the need to close the gap between state and society. Mm-hmm. Direct connection to legitimacy. And I think that I'm trying to not give away what my takeaways of your book were. I'm trying to get a better idea of how you think this idea of legitimacy and people who inside the system who understood the need to close the gap between state and society, how do we square that circle with what we just saw happening inside of Iran during these most recent protests?
Yeah,
I think that there's a direct connection between all of this, your book, and what just happened. Flesh that out a little bit for us.
Yeah, sure. So for my book, I was doing research with cultural producers in Iran's Revolutionary Guard and Basij organization, actually in the direct aftermath of the 2009 Green Movement. So I started my research that very summer that the Green Movement sort of exploded onto the scene. And in a way that I couldn't really plan at the time, my research basically was looking at how the Islamic Republic was going to respond to the crisis of credibility that the Green Movement posed to the ruling establishment. and looking at how the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij paramilitary organization were going to respond to this national upheaval at the time. Now, it's interesting because then 10 years later, the book comes out at the end of September, and then a month and a half later, we have a whole nother round of national uprisings, and the state has clamped down in a much more repressive way than 10 years ago, and also faces another form of crisis of legitimacy. So all of that to say, in answer to your question, during the research over the past 10 years with the Revolutionary Guard and Basij in Iran, part of the divisions that I began to see, I thought that I would go in seeing a lot of conversations among the Revolutionary Guard about how they need to respond to the public that had protested against them. And while there was a lot of that, so much more of the debate that was happening that I saw behind closed doors was actually among themselves about the right path forward in what the regime was going to stand for in its fourth and fifth sort of decades. So how does that relate to what we see today? Part of the struggles that I delineate in the book, or I draw out in the book, are about how though there's a contingency of the Revolutionary Guard that really believes that the Islamic Republic needs to get closer to the people. And so it needs to talk the language of the people. It needs to listen to the people. And part of where that comes from, it's really a generational divide. Part of where that comes from is from the generation of those who fought in the Iran-Iraq War, whose wives, for the most part, and also children, have become reformists and have come home every single day and challenged their fathers about what it is that they stand for. But in this entire sort of political milieu, what you also have is Khamenei, the supreme leader, who felt that the reformist surge in the late 1990s, as well as the Green Movement, was a direct threat to his political legitimacy, right? A direct threat to him as a leader. So he helps to cultivate a whole new generation of Basijis from the late 1990s onwards that are completely loyal to him. And the curriculum that they built for this younger generation is all based on sort of battlefield terminology. And what do I mean by that? Everything is done in terms of war. So it's about how there are always enemies within. It's the Khodi Ghair Khodi divide, the us-them divide, and that there's always a soft war and sometimes leans more towards a hot war coming in from outside. So as I was looking at how they were dealing with 2009, it really pertains to today as well, because I think that the forces that are trying to take over power today in Iran are the forces that are extremely loyal to Khamenei. And they're the ones who, year after year in elections, they would constantly get pushed aside because the electorate kept voting for reformists and moderates. With Trump pulling out of the JCPOA, the Iran deal, a year and a half ago, what ended up happening was that it didn't necessarily even matter what the electorate wanted anymore, because the hardline factions in the Islamic Republic felt vindicated by Trump, because Trump showed them that they were right in saying that the West and America could never be trusted. So in this political decision that Trump made to pull out of the Iran deal, what ended up happening was that they actually ended up leaving the reformists and moderates out to dry in Iran. And what that meant was that the hardline factions not only could say, "I told you so," but also maximum pressure laid the foundations for Iran. I mean, maximum pressure is not just about sanctions, right? And that's the part that we think about, that we hear about constantly in the news. But maximum pressure is also about cyber war campaign against Iran. It's also about covert actions. It's also about heavy sorts of disinformation campaigns that are being funneled money into from abroad. So in this atmosphere, the Islamic Republic feels that it is in a state of war with the United States. And what that means is that those hardline factions, and especially the younger generations of the Basij and Revolutionary Guard, who have been trained in this battlefield mentality, are now gaining more and more power in the Islamic Republic. And that's one of the reasons I think that we had such a strong repression that happened 2 weeks ago, is partially because what they see anything as an existential threat to them now, and as something that's potentially being led from outside. And so what that means is that when people are protesting in the streets, for the people in charge of the Revolutionary Guard today, politics only means force. So the people who are protesting on the streets, for those who are in power in the Revolutionary Guard, it doesn't compute that they may have political demands. What they see, the way that they see what's happening, is that this is a direct threat to them and their power structure. So therefore, they will clamp down. And this is why I think it's really important for us to understand these different strands in the Revolutionary Guard, because it means that we have, then we can begin to sort of understand the power structure.
Absolutely. I mean, so much good stuff that you said there that I want to unpack. First and foremost, I want to start with this idea of security services in Iran, the IRGC, the Basij, et cetera, not being monolithic.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they are painted in broad brush strokes, especially individuals in the Trump administration. They say both publicly and privately countless times to me when I was in Washington, D.C., that they're all the same. They're all cut from the same cloth. And I don't believe that to be true, whether we're talking about Iran's security services more specifically, but I definitely don't believe that to be true if we're talking about the Iranian government writ large, and I think that point has been proven ad nauseum. But I want to focus more on this idea of shades of gray within Iran's security services. When you were doing your research in the country, talk to me a little bit more about those shades of gray that you came across and what stood out to you about them.
Yeah, so, part of the reason I even wanted to do this research was because prior to doing this research, I was focusing on the student movements and the women's movement in Iran. And then I read a bunch of things earlier on in graduate school, which basically sort of was making the point that academics study those who they are sympathetic to for the most part, especially academics that do fieldwork, long-term fieldwork, like I did. And part of the reason for that is to do long-term fieldwork, you spend a lot of time with the people that you're doing fieldwork with. So it makes sense that you want to spend a lot of your time with people that you sympathize with, right? But what that actually ends up doing is we have a lot of knowledge production about resistance groups that academics have a lot of sympathy towards, but we don't have knowledge about the systems of power beyond just studying them as institutions. So who are the people that make up these systems of power? And so part of what I wanted to do was to sort of take an anthropological eye to those who have power within the security apparatus in Iran, because I think that in order to even understand how to best resist repressive systems, we have to understand those systems in 3D, not as these sort of 2D things that we study from far away and that we dislike for the sake of disliking them. So in that quest to do that, part of what I found was, just like you said, the Revolutionary Guard is sort of painted, or any of the security apparatuses in Iran are painted in this way that the supreme leader says something and then like sheep, they all listen and the order is followed down the line. But that's not the way it is at all. On the ground, I found actually a lot of disagreements among different factions of the Revolutionary Guards, a lot of, and very, very hot debates between them about what the future should be like. And a lot of, debate in general, right? And so part of what I think that goes to show is that this is not a monolithic system by any means. And that's why I think it's really difficult to figure out exactly what is happening today and what the shakeup of what's happening today will mean in the next few weeks to few months, because there are a lot of competing forces within the political, not only just within the political establishment in Iran, but within the security and military establishment as well.
And that last point is particularly poignant, because if you think that the IRGC is monolithic, or if you think the Basij is monolithic, or if you think the security services writ large are monolithic, and you operate on that false premise, which I think your book does an excellent job of parsing through, then how can you as a foreign government, whether you're the United States or some other Western democracy, or the Russians or the Chinese or any country in between, how can you make informed policy decisions? How can you have a strategy towards this particular country if you don't understand the proper power structures and how alliances and enmities can shift from one day to the next almost sometimes? Right. I would love to be a fly on the wall inside Iran's Supreme National Security Council right now.
I know.
To hear the debates that are taking place about what the reaction was, who was in favor of it, who wasn't, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes that stuff comes out in memoirs, but more often than not, we don't hear about that kind of stuff. So it would be super interesting to hear what somebody like the head of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani, thinks about what's been happening.
Right.
It'd be super interesting to hear about what somebody like Rouhani thinks was taking place, given his let's call it political evolution, if you will, over the past 20 years. And it would be very interesting to hear the kind of advice that's being sent up from the Supreme National Security Council to the leader. Because while we think, I shouldn't say we, while I think that he was probably in favor of the response as it played out, you're only, if you were as a political leader, you are only as smart as the people that you surround yourself with. So while that might be his personal inclination, I don't know any better than the next, I'm pretty sure that there was a lot of people telling him that this was the right way to go about it. But I'm also sure that there were some people telling him that this was a mistake and that, they're going to have to pay for sins committed, and it might not be easy to put the toothpaste back in the tube by overreacting. And I want to get to this point because you mentioned that the clampdown this time around, a couple of weeks ago, was a lot harder than what we saw in 2009 or subsequent protests that broke out, like, for example, end of 2017, beginning of 2018. Why do you think that is? I think you touched upon a little bit of it already, but flesh out why you think we saw an unusually hard crackdown by Islamic Republic standards this time around.
I think a few things. One is that the wider geopolitical situation in which Iran finds itself in has made it so that Iran does feel that it is in a state of war vis-a-vis the U.S. So that's part of it. Another part is that the level of economic mismanagement, the inflation being as high as it is, frustration with the Rouhani government, all of that has also produced a citizenry that is sort of just completely fed up, right? And so that leads to folks coming out in a way that they're very, very angry with the current situations on the ground, and they have reason to be angry. Now, from the state's perspective, that anger, the way that they are processing it because of feeling like they are in a state of war, is that they are processing it as a threat to their power, right? So understanding that means that we also have to understand. So why did the crackdown today look so different than the crackdown in 2009, for example? I think one of the ways that we have to understand this too is to understand how the Revolutionary Guard in Iran has been very intimately involved in the war in Syria, and how many of these folks who are cracking down in Iran today also saw, they got experience and they were battled. They got experience in Syria doing a lot of similar things that we just saw them do in Iran. That's another thing to understand in all of this too. And this is where I think sort of moving away from the discussion about what happened recently is also thinking about, how will people show their discontent going forward in a political situation in which the ruling government sees any protest as a threat to their power structure, which then means that they will clamp down like this, I think, going forward, at least in this current environment. So what that means is any sort of protest movement has the potential of being heavily repressed in this way. And this is why I think that, first of all, we're entering a new era in the Islamic Republic. And secondly, we're going to have to think about ways of resisting this form of power in more complex ways than we have thought of in the past.
I was talking to a journalist who will remain nameless just because I've been doing everything off the record since I left DC, right? I still talk to journalists. I still talk to government people across the world. I just don't do it on the record anymore. And this guy called me from overseas. You probably know him. And he asked me what was going on with the protests, and I kind of gave my readout of what I thought what was going on to the best of my ability, acknowledging full well the very real blind spots. But I told him something from my gut, and I made sure to tell him that it was coming from my gut, and it was nothing more than an educated guess. Because he asked me, he said, well, what do you think the internal dynamics are going to be going forward? How do you think it will play out? And I said, look, I didn't mention the Syria part, and I'm glad you did, because that's poignant, and that hadn't occurred to me, but you're absolutely right about that, and I haven't heard anybody else mention it either. Like, they learned lessons. And I also think it's connected to the degree to which, they look at all the countries around them that are on fire, and they're like, that's not happening here. So that's a very real factor that I think plays into it. But what I told this guy was, I was like, you may think you've seen a militarized version of Iranian politics, but you haven't.
No.
But you're about to.
Yes.
You are about to.
Yes.
Like, for lack of better term, shit's about to get real.
Yes, it is. And this is, you can put all this in here, but this is part of what I've been racking my brain. I've been just sort of sitting here racking my brain the past few days, because the way that I'm seeing what's happening based off of spending so much time with the Revolutionary Guard and Basij in Iran is that I do think we are headed into a potential future of the Islamic Republic that looks closer to a military dictatorship than anything else. Obviously, because of divisions within the Revolutionary Guard, we may not get there, because there are going to be forces within them that don't want to drag the state to that level. But because of Syria, look, Khamenei is not going to get on a plane and leave Iran the way that the Shah did. Where the hell is he going to go? He can't even be allowed anywhere because of the sanctions against him, nor can many of the other people within the Islamic Republic. They are going to fight until the end, right? Yep. And this is what I think is dangerous. That a lot of these, I think the Islamic Republic has reached a stage where we do need to think about how do we envision a political future beyond the Islamic Republic. However, given current realities on the ground, any sort of armed resistance against the Islamic Republic is going to be political suicide in this atmosphere, because they are in an atmosphere of war and they will clamp down, and they are more powerful than Syria. They are more better armed than Syria, and it's a bigger country than Syria. So, and they learned many lessons in Syria, and one of the lessons that they learned is that you can be brutal, and it doesn't matter the extent of people that you kill, but you can still hold on to power that way. I think that's a very dangerous scenario that we're up against, right? But then what that also means is that when I say we have to think about different forms of resistance, I've been thinking the past few days a lot about going back and reading about the way people resisted military dictatorships in Latin America, for example.
Wow,
right?
That's a great idea.
Because I think in these situations, resistance needs to exist, but it might need to change its form. I actually think it will have to change its form, because if the Islamic Republic is able to keep power in the coming months, then it will further securitize the domestic sphere. And that means that any kind of street politics will be dealt with a heavy hand. So that means, how do you resist a system like this without necessarily protesting in the streets, but showing your protest and your discontent in different ways? And also, I think what's really important here is, how do you articulate a vision for a political future that is viable, and that does not fall back on the same fault lines of the Islamic Republic or the revolution or the pre-revolutionary period in Iran? Meaning, how do we actually move forward and not back to an old, the son of the monarch, or to a Mujahideen Khalq, like cult organization from the outside? But actually, we've had so many incredible social movements in Iran in the past 40 years, many of which have been repressed heavily by the Islamic Republic. Many of their leaders have been either pushed into exile or imprisoned or killed. But we do have a lot of experience in Iranian civic life for very dynamic discussions about what the future can hold. The problem, though, is that in this political environment, the only ones who have the platforms and the voice are the crazies. And so I think that's something that I think, as scholars, intellectuals, thinkers, activists, just general people who are concerned about what's happening in Iran, now our focus needs to become on how do we articulate an inclusive vision for what we want for Iran going forward.
I think that's going to be a very important conversation to have, and I think it's going to be a conversation that's going to be ongoing.
Yeah.
Even perhaps as additional protests might pop up, because it's almost impossible to predict the rhyme and reason that might cause protests to break out inside of Iran. Like, if you would have told me a couple weeks ago, Iran is going to raise gasoline prices, I would have been like, yeah, they should have done it a long time ago. Just from an economic perspective, it's not smart to heavily subsidize this kind of stuff, to the extent that they do. However, I understood the variety of reasons why they were doing it. And for God's sakes, population deserves a break in some way, shape, or form. If it's got to be cheap gas prices, so be it. But I would not have anticipated that the rollout would have been as non-existent and awful as it was. Nor would I have anticipated, as somebody who's done this for 15 years, that would have been the issue that would have caused people to go out on the streets. I would have thought it would have been something else, any number of issues. So that's just to say, precisely because it's very difficult for any of us to predict what will be not the straw that breaks the camel's back. I think that language might be too strong, but what might be a trigger to cause people to go back out on the streets. Like, those two things are not mutually exclusive. That conversation that's so important that you mentioned can be happening simultaneously.
Exactly.
And in fact, since the outset of the reform movement in the 90s, some of the intellectual brain power, like the intellectual architects, of the reform movement were like, it's got to be bottom up to affect the top. That was the mindset. I mean, they went and shot those people in the face and tried to kill them at the time, unfortunately. But those were the people that were like, yes, we need to channel the people's power from the bottom to affect the decision making at the top. And just because it hasn't played out in the effective manner that I think Iranians inside of Iran would have liked to have seen over the past 20, 30 years, I don't think that fundamental premise has been eliminated or the need for it has been changed. So I agree with you is what I'm trying to say. That conversation is going to need to continue. Now, one thing we haven't talked about in any detail yet that I want to dive into now with you is this idea of the external factors. I agree with your assessment wholeheartedly that Trump pulling out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, really pulled the rug out from a lot of political officials and security officials inside of Iran who are advocating for and in the process of implementing a different way of Iran going about its business. Really trying to dig Iran out of the hole that the Ahmadinejad years put Iran into. And the JCPOA was meant to be a foundation from which additional dialogue on other points of contention with the outside world could grow. Iran acknowledged that, the Obama people acknowledged that, the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, they all acknowledged that to me in my conversations with them. Then the rug gets pulled out from underneath them. And I think the quid pro quo with the Supreme Leader and others in the system was, no, just because the rug has been pulled out from under you doesn't mean that you get to leave now. You have to stay, and you have to help manage this, because this was your initiative. These were your ideas, and they didn't work. They didn't work, and we told you so. Like you mentioned earlier, we told you this wasn't going to work. So now you have to do what we want to do, and you have to implement what we want to implement. You have to go along with us as opposed to us going along with you. Even though the hardliners never really went along with it, I would argue. But that's neither here nor there. The point being, rug gets pulled out from underneath these guys, and now you have a situation where how could they possibly go into National Security Council meetings inside of Iran or other meetings of any modicum of importance and argue for what they were arguing for before? Even if that's their personal policy inclination, which it is. I do think people like Rouhani and Zarif would like to have diplomacy, dialogue, and find ways to solve problems with the United States or other countries in the region, whoever it might be, because they know what the alternative is. We're seeing it now. I guess my question to you is twofold. One, to what extent do you think that the Trump administration withdrawing from the JCPOA and pursuing this maximum pressure, we'll call it policy because it's not a strategy, to what extent do you think that has impacted internal Iranian political developments, A? And B, to what extent do you think that to what extent do you think that if the United States were to shift its policies to something that more resembled the previous administration, that things could get back on a more positive trajectory? Or do you think that ship has sailed?
It's a really good question. I mean, I'm of the camp that thinks that Trump pulling out of the JCPOA altered domestic politics quite a bit in Iran, because I think that the Rouhani-Zarif sort of faction of Iranian politics had put basically all their eggs in that basket, in the diplomacy basket, and obviously Trump pulling out of it, and then not just pulling out of it, but putting all of these sanctions on it, the EU not really being able to do anything at all, sort of demonstrated, not just to the hardliners in Iran, but also to not, everyone else, that that ultimately the powers that be want the Islamic Republic and Iran to be a weaker state, right? So in that political reality, I think it ended up dealing a very harsh blow to those within the system that wanted a different kind of politics with the international community, but especially the Western countries. Now, as far as your second question, if things go back to a similar kind of framework, what's going to happen? I honestly don't know, but my gut says that first it'll depend on what the parliamentary elections end up being. Will people vote or not? Who will come? I think actually the biggest internal debate right now, one of the bigger internal debates beyond like how many people were killed and why was this crackdown the way that it was, but the other big internal debate is, will people vote in the parliamentary and presidential elections? Because as much as especially Khamenei and his camp of folks, as repressive as they are, the vote still matters to them. They want to be able to point to the fact that they have quote unquote legitimacy because people are voting. So what happens if there's an actual boycott of the vote? I don't know, right? But I don't know how then the Islamic Republic will react if fewer people come out and vote. And then I don't know what the future of that means, depending on, does Trump get reelected here or not? And then who gets elected on the presidency side in Iran within a year? If it's going to be Trump's reelection plus someone that's more hardline, I think it's a completely different scenario than if we have a Democrat elected and then, we don't even know who has the potential to become president in Iran today.
Totally.
But I don't think we can, this line that the Democrats have that let's go back to the JCPOA and we can sort of roll everything back. I don't think that it's not going to be as simple as that.
Nope, not at all. Not at all. And nor should it be, frankly.
Nor should it be, yeah.
Nor should it be. A lot has changed in that regard. And I think that, it's funny. As I'm sitting here listening to you talk, I'm having a little bit of deja vu. I'm having a flash of deja vu because, I remember writing a report in 2013 before Rouhani got elected. A couple months before Rouhani got elected, we published it. And for this report, we were doing interviews with people inside of Iran. And one of the people that we were interviewing inside of Iran said, I was talking with somebody that connected with the security services and asking him how he felt about the situation. Now, you have to remember, this is end of Ahmadinejad. The Obama administration was sanctioning anything and everything, which laid the foundation for what we see today. Yeah. Because even after the JCPOA, not all sanctions were lifted. And it was a problem. Right. But the United States and Iran at that point in time were trying to keep the problems under wraps for their own domestic political considerations. But this guy who we interviewed said, I go and talk to the security services, and they tell me that they love what's going on right now because they have an unlimited budget, and every request they make for everything is getting approved. Yeah. All under the auspices of, protecting Iran, the country, from this foreign aggression, which their perception was, rightly or wrongly, and at this point I think we could say rightly, given what the Trump administration is doing, trying to overthrow the Iranian government. So I feel like we're back in this situation now where that's exactly what's happening. Unlimited budgets, and people criticize the money that Iran is spending in Syria and elsewhere outside of Iran's borders. Well, if that stuff is important to Iran, where they're willing to spend the amount that they're spending, imagine how much they're going to be willing to spend inside the country. Right. And I think that that's a kind of a no-brainer that a lot of people don't, or they either don't or are unwilling to acknowledge. Right? The Trump administration says that Iran has got this horrible cast of characters. Well, who do you think you're empowering? I guess you're empowering the very people that you say you hate the most. It's almost like they're doing it intentionally, but they're not smart enough to do it intentionally. Because I know a lot of these people, and I guarantee you, they're not. They're ideologues. It's different. Yeah. I want to get to this idea though of you talked about the leader. You talked about Khamenei. I want to get to this idea of red lines. Yeah. Because I think that generally speaking, as this guy who used to work at the State Department and got to learn from a lot of dudes who are a lot smarter than me, I learned this idea that red lines become flexible lines Otherwise, there's nothing to negotiate over. And I think that can oftentimes hold true for domestic politics and also foreign politics. Now, in the context of Iran, what do you see as their red lines in terms of their domestic policies and their foreign policies?
In the current situation?
In the current situation.
I mean, I think the red lines right now are the system as a whole, right? Keeping the system alive. For the forces that are gaining power in Iran right now, the Velayat Faqih, so the position of the leader, the supreme leader itself, is a red line. And I think for various reasons, things, at least in the short term, things like the veil are the red line. I actually don't know if in the longer term, if they end up surviving or not, something like the veil will be a red line or not. And I think, I mean, right now, the red line, I think for me, the biggest red line that I see them talking about over and over again is really like hifz and nizam, just like making sure that the system stays intact. And so, you know, the fact that is vague, I think that's the power, right? Keeping it vague in that way, because anything can fall under hifz and nizam. Anything can fall under keeping the system alive. And at this point where they feel like they are under such existential threat from all sides, internally, externally, all of these ways, anything falls under the rubric of keeping the system alive, being the red line. And so that's partially why I think we're seeing the crackdowns that we are. And also we're going to just see them going forward more and more. As long as maximum pressure stays the way that it does, this is going to be the situation we're going to have.
What about in terms of Iran's foreign policies? Do you see any red lines?
In what way? What do you mean? Like for?
So, for example, let me just give you an example of something that's happened in the past that might highlight like what I mean when I ask the question. So, when Iran was negotiating over its nuclear program, one red line that they had was that there must be some enrichment of uranium on Iranian soil. What was actually negotiated upon was the size and scope.
Yeah.
So do you see any red lines with regards to Iran's foreign policies, whether it be a specific interaction with the United States or its broader interactions with the world more generally, or do you think that it's in flux and hard to pin down? It's hard, I know.
I honestly don't know.
Yeah, I totally understand that. That's why I asked the question. Yeah. A lot of the questions that I'm asking you is because I'm like, well, I don't know if I have a good answer, so let me ask somebody who might. And if you don't, that's totally understandable. It's a tough question to answer because things are so fluid right now.
Yeah.
You know, there's my general view is that there's a vacuum.
Yeah.
Right? And power abhors vacuums.
Yeah.
So you have individuals inside of Iran who are trying to step up and fill the vacuum. You've got the Saudis and the Emiratis who are trying to step up and fill the vacuum, but you know the Saudis and the Emiratis aren't good at really anything except paying other people to do stuff for them. So that's failed. The Europeans have outsourced their security to the United States, so they're not good at stepping up and filling the vacuum. So that's why you see people talking about, oh, the Russians are doing this, the Chinese are doing this. I mean, yes, but I think to a certain extent, it's also the same way that Iran benefited from American mistakes post 9/11 and post Iraq war invasion. Like, it's not to say that the Iranians aren't good at strategy. It's to say that they were gifted a power vacuum, which they were in a much better position to take advantage of than the United States or any other actor. And I think that that's kind of what we're seeing now.
What's the vacuum you're saying now? That Trump is the vacuum you're saying? Like,
I think that to a certain extent, yes. To a certain extent, yes. But the geopolitical analyst in me also thinks that the security framework or the architecture for security that the United States set up in the Middle East was always unsustainable because it was predicated on including some and excluding others. And it doesn't work that way because all that does is incentivize the countries who are you excluding, whether it be Iran or Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Gaddafi's Libya, to destabilize that which they have been excluded from.
Yeah.
So one thing I actually agree with Rouhani and Zarif on is when they talk about this need for an inclusive security framework. That's the only way. in my view.
Yeah.
But I thought that before I actually had the opportunity to sit down and talk to these guys face to face, right? Like it's one of those things where it's not rocket science at the end of the day. Like if you cut Iran out, they're going to destabilize the process. If you cut the Saudis out, they're going to destabilize the process.
Right.
If you cut the Israelis out, they're going to destabilize the process. So
yeah, I mean, there's something fundamentally flawed with the calculation of geopolitics vis-a-vis nation states. Right?
Yeah, right.
The current way that we've set up international politics, that is the ultimate flaw of what you just explained.
I agree.
Yeah,
it's unsustainable, and until there's a rethink as to how power is projected, things will get worse before they get better.
I agree.
Actually, this feeds into an interesting question. If you were called into the White House or the State Department to brief senior U.S. officials on Iran, what policy recommendations would you give them?
So I'm going to answer this in a way that you might not expect.
Right.
I'm not interested in making any policy recommendations. Not just to this administration, but any administration, because I actually think that we need an entire rethink of our foreign policy. And so under current parameters, I'm not actually interested in giving policy recommendations.
What if you had to list off 3 tenets of what you think that rethink of foreign policy would entail, broadly conceived, what would you consider the top 3 tenets to be?
The very first tenet is to rethink American exceptionalism.
Amen.
So I mean, then this is why I'm saying, like, for me, I actually, even though I'm sitting at a school in DC, I'm an academic. I'm not a policymaker, right? And I went into academia very purposely, and I didn't go into policymaking very purposely. And part of the reason for that is that I actually, I value what policymakers do, and I think it's very important work. But for me, I actually think there are fundamental flaws in the ways in which we think about international politics. And the flaws that I see are sort of grander flaws that, one can critique me and say, well, you're living in academic la-la land. And I am, but I chose to live in academic la-la land because I think we need some fundamental changes in how we think about U.S. politics, foreign politics, just politics in general vis-a-vis nation states. And so it's not that I necessarily am against, it's that I think U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has been detrimental. I think that this idea of American exceptionalism has been detrimental to the United States, not just
100%.
To other countries around the world, right?
100%.
I actually think that for the U.S. and for U.S. national security, this idea of American exceptionalism has been wrong and has been detrimental. So I cannot, in any good faith, give policy recommendations to any American president, whether it's Obama or Trump or anyone else, under these current circumstances. So I actually wouldn't be the person in the White House or anywhere else giving those recommendations.
No,
because I don't want to do it.
Yeah, I respect the answer. You're right. It's not the answer that I was expecting, but it's actually a refreshing answer, right? It's an intellectually honest answer. I share your view, and this was one of the biggest frustrations for me spending all the time in Washington that I did working on this stuff is, like, shit was broken. Like, the very foundation, the very fundamentals were broken to the point where I know for a fact, because some people would privately acknowledge it to me, that they saw how the game was played and understood what they needed to say and not say in order to advance their careers in the policy field, and they proceeded accordingly. Yeah. And to me, like, at first, when I first got to DC, I was like, oh, these sellouts, like, how could they possibly? And I was just like, okay, like, let me focus less on what other people are doing and not be critical of others, because life's all about choices, and you want to make the choices in life you want to make by all means. Let me focus on myself and try to operate within the framework that I'm being forced to operate in, and that I'm choosing to operate in, because I wanted to change things, right? And I still believe that things need to be changed. Yeah. But I think that the change that needs to happen is on that fundamentally different level that you just articulated. I completely agree. Like, you can't make sound policy and can't receive sound advice if you're operating on a premise that's fundamentally flawed.
Right. And you know, I think like actually I do think that there's power in being in an academic space in the sense that I think we need new ideas. And I think we need and you know, one of the nice things about being an academic is that we sort of have the privilege to you know, ideally have the time to sit and think and read and think about new ideas and write about new ideas. And I think actually I never, you know, I'm trained as an anthropologist. I never thought I would see myself in the middle of DC working on Iran at a foreign policy school. This is not my training. I never really imagined myself in a space like this, but here I am. And being in a space like this has made me realize one of the reasons I even took this job is that I didn't want to just be critiquing from the outside, right? But one of the things I've learned since being here is how fundamentally corrupt the American foreign policy establishment is. And what I mean by that is like, it's astounding for me how there's like a revolving door in DC. So when your administration is not in power, you sort of revolve out of the government and you go into think tanks or university spaces within DC, and then you wait it out and then you go back in. So while you're waiting it out, you're actually not making fundamental critiques to American foreign policy because you're actually trying to hold your space in order to go back in. So you're not going to critique because you need your space to still be there when you're ready to go back in, right? I think that is... How are we going to make good policy in an environment like that? A. B, it's also fundamentally corrupt because of the amount of money and influence that exists in our foreign policy in this country. From lobbying to, different PR from different countries and firms and all of that sort of stuff. So people are writing think pieces or in think tanks or writing op-eds that are being sort of for all intents and purposes, being paid to toe a certain line. Right. That I think is in that way, we're defining our foreign policy based on the highest bidder. I think that's fundamentally flawed. So I actually believe that we can have a better American foreign policy if we sort of come at it from a position of fundamental critique of the system that we have right now. But we're not having that conversation in this city. And so absent that conversation, I'm actually not interested in being a part of the policy conversation because I think we're just going to sort of continue the cycle. It might look a little bit better, but I mean, and this goes back to your previous question about, you know, what if we go back to the JCPOA or what if we go back to that? And part of what I'm coming to realize, and actually one of our PhD students here is working on this is, you know, even if the JCPOA had stuck, let's say Hillary Clinton had gotten elected, there could have been, and there probably would have been, sanctions on Iran's missile program. There would have, right? Like the conflict between Iran and the United States is 40 years long because in many ways it's sort of institutionalized in this way. And so that is what I mean by like a corrupt foreign policy establishment is that we're actually not thinking about what's good for American foreign policy. We're thinking about certain interests that are at play.
And that's exactly why I asked the question.
Yeah.
That's exactly why I asked the question. Because as somebody who's doing the interviewing, you don't want to ask leading questions. Like I have my views and my ideas on how things are. And I know that you and I agree on a lot of stuff, but I don't know if we agree on everything. Right. So here's my opportunity to ask the question, see what you think, and even potentially learn something from you. Who's still in the belly of the beast, as they say. But I couldn't agree more. And when I left government and then went to go work at NIAC, that was my goal. The degree to which I was able to accomplish that goal, I'll leave that for others to decide. But the goal was like, this is broken and people aren't having the conversation that needs to be had. So where's a space that I can go to have that conversation in a way where I feel like I can rest my head on my pillow at night and feel good about myself and my life. And I was able to do that for 8 years. And for most of those years, my mission was accomplished in terms of being able to put my head on my pillow and I can feel good about it, right? And there just aren't, I struggle to think of spaces in Washington, D.C. where that exists because it is corrupt. It just is. And, the way that the game is played is fundamentally flawed. And I give credit to people, whether they be former U.S. government officials, the handful who speak out against this kind of stuff. but also especially academics. And I think towards the end of my tenure at NIAC, like I championed reaching out to academia to get those kind of ideas brought in. And you can see that with the kind of reports that we wrote, that I was leading on, and the kind of expert statements that we were that I was leading on. Like, why don't we get this person? Why don't we get that person? And the idea was always, no, we need to get this former U.S. government person, that go for me. Okay, yeah, let's get some of those. But most of those people won't sign on to this stuff.
Yeah.
They don't want to say this kind of stuff publicly because they either don't agree with it, they're afraid of the consequences of saying it.
Yeah.
So long-winded way of saying, yeah, you're absolutely right.
I mean, it's interesting too, like walking into a space like DC on Iran, it's been really fascinating seeing the reactions that people have to me. And it took me a really hard time to figure out, I mean, this is not the friendliest town. And it took me a very hard time to figure out, like, why were people reacting this way to me? And part of what I came to realize is that, okay, in this town, everyone is sort of vying for jobs for the future, right? And I realized, because I wasn't in the framework of DC, I realized that's how they saw me too. Is like, okay, is this someone who's new in town who wants to be vying for these policy or diplomatic or whatever positions in the future? And it took me a while to understand that that's how people were seeing me. And I now start out every meeting with, I have zero interest in going into policy or the diplomatic world. I love being an academic. And this is what, I mean, I chose this path. I want to do this path. I have zero interest in going into that other path. And ever since I've realized that, and that I have also like been able to articulate that to people I meet, I'm realizing that it actually helps shift the conversation a little bit. Cause I'm like, look, I'm not gunning for your job. I'm not gunning for the next Iran job in any administration, in the Democratic administration or any administration in the future. So actually what I'm interested in doing is helping to think critically about questions that we need to be asking when it comes to Iran or when it comes to how we understand our world or anything like that. But yeah, I've realized that in this city, everyone is sort of gunning for those positions.
Yeah. Well, you learned faster than most. And I give you the credit that you deserve for, having the guts to put that in your, like, one of the first things that you say when you have these conversations with people, because you're absolutely right. It does help them, like, let their guard down.
Yeah.
And I won't say, look, my guess would be that it doesn't eliminate the toxicity and negativity that emanates from a lot of people that work in this field in DC, which I have no doubt that you've experienced, and I've certainly experienced my fair share of it as well. So everybody, go pick up the book, Iran Reframed. I could talk to Narges for hours and hours about all these kinds of things, but I don't want to manipulate all of her time going forward. But I hope as the podcast continues to get established and grows, I can have you back if other stuff in Iran pops up that is worth talking about. Because in my humble opinion, you are one of a handful of people that are worthy of listening to when it comes to this kind of stuff.
That means a lot coming from you. This was so fun. I appreciate that.
And now it's time for this week's mailbag, where you ask me any questions you have about what's going on in the world today, and I try to answer to the best of my ability. If you have a question, don't be shy. Email them to info@iranian.com with your name and location, and I'll do my best to answer as many questions I can on the next podcast. So without further ado, let's dive right in. The first question from this week's mailbag is from Mehdad, and he's writing from Kirkland, Washington. Shout out to Kirkland, Washington. He says, Iran just started candidate registration for parliamentary elections. In light of the protests, discontent, and heavy-handedness by authorities in dealing with protesters, do you feel that there will be low voter turnout? And if so, how concerned should the government be about this? That's a great question, Mehdad. Thanks for writing in. Yeah, I think the Iranian government should always be concerned about low voter turnout. And I do think that there are a variety of reasons why there is the potential for low voter turnout. I can't say it's a certitude at this point because a lot can change between now and the parliamentary elections that are upcoming. And I think that first and foremost, when Iranian voters go to the polls, if they don't see the possibility for the kinds of changes to take place that will better fulfill their political, economic, and social aspirations, then they're less likely to go to the polls. I think we saw that, for example, in 2005, Iran's presidential election, where Ahmadinejad came to power. Voter turnout was low by Iranian standards, and that allowed the most hardline candidate to win. Whereas if you juxtapose 2005 with 2013 and 2017 presidential elections, Hassan Rouhani won the presidential election in both of those years, and the high voter turnout propelled him. And he was running on a platform of hope and change, much like Obama in 2008. But I don't think that the majority of Iranian voters can look at Rouhani's record at this point in time and say that he was able to accomplish all that he set out to accomplish. Some of that, of course, is self-inflicted wounds. Others is essentially, the worst cast of characters inside the Iranian government preventing him from being able to accomplish the objectives that he set out. But for all intents and purposes, that could drive voter turnout to be low. And yeah, I do think that the Iranian government's response to the protests, completely unacceptable by international best practices and standards, could cause voters to stay home. It's well within the realm of possibility. But I think it's equally important to acknowledge that at this point, we just don't know. I think at this point, we're still trying to figure out everything that happened during those protests. Pictures, stories, et cetera, are still coming out of the country as a result of the internet essentially being shut down. So I think this is an important question. It's a space that we should continue to watch. And I think the weeks and months ahead will be very telling in that regard. So thanks, Mehrdad, for your question. Question number 2 from the mailbag is from Ali, who's writing from Washington, D.C. Shout out to Washington, D.C. So he says the Saudis pump millions of dollars into think tanks, PR, and lobbying firms to curry political favor. Now that Democrats and Republicans are pushing for sanctions against Saudi Arabia and public opinion is firmly against them, is Saudi money now toxic, or is this just noise that does not change business as usual for America's foreign policy? It's a great question. I think that a reevaluation of America's relationship with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, and other countries in the Middle East is long overdue. And what I mean by that is I don't think we should cut off relations with these countries. I don't think that we should abandon all of the hard work that's gone into forming strong ties with these countries. But I do think that a cost-benefit analysis that is more right-sized and more in line with America's actual interests should be applied to the relationships that we have with these countries. Meaning, when these countries do things that go against America's interests, then we hold them accountable for it. And if they're not willing to work with us to achieve American interests, then we look for other countries in the region, say Iran, for example, who might have interests that overlap with us. And if they do, then that allows the United States to say, okay, Saudi Arabia, Israel, UAE, if you're not willing to play ball with us, then perhaps there's another country that will. And the ability to balance one side off the other actually allows us to better achieve American interests over the long run. But more to your question, I think that's part 1 of it, but more to your question, I appreciate the fact that more members of Congress are speaking up, both Democrats and some Republicans, about the need to hold Saudi Arabia accountable. I remain skeptical as to the degree that the Saudis will truly be punished and that business as usual will fundamentally change. This relationship that we have with Saudi Arabia, I think, was institutionalized by a variety of different presidents, both Republican and Democrat. And I think Trump, coming into office, he was the first American president to accept full scale the Saudi, Emirati, and Israeli view of security in the region. American interests be damned. And as a result of that, I think you've seen one debacle after another. I mean, from end of 2016, Trump came into office in 2017, not 2016. He was elected in 2016. So from 2017, the beginning of 2017 until the present, you've seen a laundry list of mess-ups, shall we call them, on the part of these 3 countries, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the UAE. And they've not benefited American interests in any tangible way, shape, or form. And they've actually set back American interests in addition to their own respective interests, right? And I think that they were banking on being able to use the United States with Trump as president essentially as a mercenary to fight their battles for them. And that's clearly proven to not be the case. And I think that's why you see the Saudis and the Emiratis reaching out to Iran and trying to form some kind of dialogue, low-key, sometimes behind the scenes, and sometimes very overtly in public view, right? Because they're realizing that, when they outsource their security, whether it be to the United States or anyone else, then they're inherently insecure. So perhaps we will see a bit of a course correction with regards to U.S.-Saudi relations, but I don't think you're going to see the full-scale changes that I think are necessary to, prioritize American interests the way that they should be. I think, depending on who wins the next presidential election, then we can revisit this question. But for all intents and purposes, I do think that those kinds of fundamental changes that a lot of people would like to see, myself included, are not going to be happening in the short to medium term. But we can hold out hope and work towards those kinds of changes for the long term. So thank you, Ali, for your question on that. The next question in the mailbag comes from Nazanin, and she's writing from San Antonio, Texas. Shout out to San Antonio. Nazanin says, these days, when on social media, it's hard to distinguish between supporters of the MEK, Reza Pahlavi, aka monarchists, and Trump. Does anyone in Iran even consider the MEK or Reza Pahlavi as credible replacements to the Iranian government? If not them, who? Short answer, no. I mean, you're talking about a country of 80 million people, the majority of whom were not alive when the MEK or the Pahlavis had any shred of relevancy pertaining to Iranian politics. So it stretches the limits of plausibility to believe that these entities that have not stepped foot inside of the country in over 40 years would be welcomed back with open arms and could automatically step in and run the kind of government that would better fulfill the political, economic, and social aspirations of Iranians across the country. So I think we need to be careful about seeing a video on Twitter or reading something on Telegram that says, people love Reza Pahlavi or people want the MEK. It's no secret to anyone these days how social media is being manipulated for a variety of nefarious purposes. But even if you remove social media from the equation, that's like saying that who's a good example of this in the American context. That's like saying that Spyro Agnew, if he was still alive, could come back and have a political future in the United States after being a discredited and convicted, if I'm not mistaken. But anyways, he was a completely discredited vice president, was forced to leave office, and then passed away. So could somebody like that realistically come back and have a viable political future in the United States? Of course not. Now imagine if this guy was outside of the country for 40 years. So apply that same premise to Reza Pahlavi and the MEK, and we also have to consider the fact that these entities are not democratic in any way, shape, or form. They might say that they are, but they're certainly not. I mean, you look at Human Rights Watch and the reports that they've put out on the MEK, they're very damning and describe them rightfully as the cult that they are. And you look at somebody like Reza Pahlavi, I think his own personal aspirations are being put in front of the aspirations that the Iranian people have. And that's unfortunate because in that sense, he's not really different than the Iranian government that's currently in power. But if not these guys, who? That's a tough question to answer. I think, Iranians inside of Iran and outside of Iran would like to see sooner rather than later the political, economic, and social aspirations of Iranians inside of Iran being better fulfilled. I think they would like to see a more democratic Iran that respects international best practices and standards. But I don't think there's any quick fixes to get to that point. And I think the most likely scenario, even though it might not sound like the most appealing scenario, the most likely scenario, the most peaceful scenario, the most sustainable scenario is peaceful indigenous change over a long period of time inside of Iran, even if it means 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because the problems that exist are Iranian, and the people dealing with these problems are Iranian, so the solutions themselves have to be Iranian. So I hope that makes sense for you, Nazanin. Last but not least, this week, question from the mailbag. Mahmoud from Herndon, Virginia writes, with the U.S. presidential elections looming in 2020, Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii has caught my attention with her anti-imperialism, anti-war message. I'm rooting for her and Bernie as anti-establishment candidates, yet something at times seems off with her. Are there any red flags that you see with her foreign policy positions? And more to the point, what do you dislike about Tulsi as a presidential candidate? Appreciate your question, Mahmoud. It's a good one. I think there's a couple of things that I would say about Tulsi. First and foremost, I also appreciate her anti-imperialist, anti-war message. I think that it's long past due for American politicians who are running for high office to be saying those kinds of things. I'm heartened to see people like her and Bernie Sanders, and perhaps to a lesser extent Elizabeth Warren, voicing the need to wind down the endless wars and right-size America's power projection in a way that is more peaceful and diplomacy-centric, and reduces significantly the amount of militarism that we are projecting abroad. There are ways to make sure that America remains safe while also making sure that, we're not breaking things more than we're fixing them. So that's what I like about Tulsi first and foremost. But I'll be the first to admit that there are some things that stand out to me that are certainly a cause for concern. First and foremost are her ties to Hindu nationalists. I mean, she's long supported the current Indian Prime Minister Modi, and he's an anti-Islam right-winger who had previously been barred from entering the United States due to being personally implicated in deadly anti-Muslim riots. So, that's not cool. And in turn, you've seen a lot of American Hindu supporters of Indian Prime Minister Modi become some of Tulsi Gabbard's biggest donors, including some people that are disturbingly Islamophobic and some groups that are disturbingly Islamophobic. And the other thing that kind of stood out to me about Tulsi that I didn't like so much is when she talks about Islam, she talks about it in real broad brush strokes. And I find that to be problematic. And I think that she was super critical of President Obama's refusal to, make blanket statements about radical Islam, right? And I actually think that Obama had it right on that issue, and that Tulsi Gabbard needed a bit more nuance in her position on this specific issue. So those are some of the drawbacks that I see with Tulsi. But again, I give her props for having the courage to speak out against the establishment position, which is endless war, forever militarism, and putting diplomacy on the back burner and not providing it with the resources and the political, what's the word I'm looking for? The political priority that's needed to prioritize it and sell it domestically inside of America's domestic politics, which is no small task. So that's it for the mailbag this week. Make sure that if you guys have any other questions going forward, remember, don't be shy. Email me your questions, info@Iranian.com with your name and location, and I'll do my best to answer as many questions as I can on the next podcast episode. All right, guys, that's it. That's the episode for this week. Thank you all for listening. This has been The Message. I'm Reza Marashi, and I'll be back next week to give more knowledge to the people.